Hello, welcome to the Viewpoint. I am Mamadou Mbodj. This week, the Gambia marks its 58th independence anniversary. But how has life been in this state of proclaimed independence? Indeed, what does it mean to be an independent state? Maybe it's time to start asking these fundamental questions. To many in this country and across Africa, it has been a hoax played on us by our leaders. Why? Well, they say because we are now as dependent on the former colonial master and the institutions that they've created as ever. So today the topic for discussion on the Viewpoint is this: independence reappraised, which perhaps would lead us to independence reimagined for the future. I've got two gentlemen here who would help me sort of chew over some of these terms. Our guest today is a political science lecturer at the university, and he also heads the Peace, Justice and Human Security team at the Center for Research and Policy Development. He holds an MSc, a sort of science degree in security, leadership, society, from the African Leadership Center, King's College, London. He also holds a master's degree in human rights and democratization in Africa from the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. His first degree, the BSc in political science, he got it from the University of the Gambia. And he has also briefly worked for the Economic Community of West African States as a conflict monitor. Mr. Esanjai, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Mbodj.
You're welcome. And on my right, he probably doesn't need an introduction, really.
Exactly.
Mr. Adedarame, editor-in-chief, QTV, we all know that. Worked for the BBC for God knows more than 15 years, possibly close to 20. He still writes regularly, a prolific writer. And his range, even on architecture. And by the way, he's also an historian. Welcome.
A pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. First, I have to get this out of the way. You're defining memory, image, call it what you will, of independence celebrations. I think we'll have to go to our guest first, Mr. Jai.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think independence celebration, the euphoria used to be very tense, and people, will always anticipate 18th February every year to celebrate this moment. I remember my first independence celebration, a March past, I will say, was when I was in grade 5. I think this was in 2002. And I remember that year, Abdullah Wad was one of the guests, of course, guests, heads of state who came to the Gambia. And then remember, he was just 2 years into office because he came to power in 2000, and 2002 he came as a special guest of President Jammeh to witness Gambia's independence celebration. And I was there as a grade 5 student. I was so excited. I remember a day before that, in the evening, we were playing football in our neighborhood, and I got injured on my on my right foot. But at night I was crying because I was thinking that I'm going to miss the March past tomorrow. Sure. And all of a sudden, in the early morning, I told my mom that I was going, and she was like, "No, you can't go." I forced my way to make sure that I was at the March past. Even though I was kind of struggling, but I had to attend this because it was a memorable moment. Only people in grade 5 were given that opportunity. So I knew that if I had missed that opportunity, 2002, probably I wouldn't have attended any March Pass. Okay. So I decided to force my way in, and then, it was really a very memorable one. The euphoria was there, and they used to tell us that, in fact, in the 90s or so, independence celebration, normally people will go to the stadium and even spend the night there because the stadium is always jam-packed. Yeah. Everybody wants to attend it. But as time goes on, as we were going, this euphoria was diminishing, kind of. I don't know what is responsible for that. Maybe Mr. Ade will help us to.
I might.
Yeah, but it used to be a very you know, I mean, interesting and memorable, you know, moment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Where you've got stadium, I've got McCarthy Square.
Wow.
Yes, I
it
mean,
is.
for myself, and this is where I show off my age and my kind of age credentials in the fact that I lived through Sierra Leone's independence in 1961 and also the Gambia's, to the extent that my father, who was born in the Gambia, actually came to the Gambia to observe the handover. And so the Sierra Leone one is very vivid for me. And in fact, some people are surprised at how vivid it is for me. And in fact, a friend about 10 years ago challenged me because I'd written something. And I said, the memory was so vivid, I can actually take you to the spot I was standing at when the Duke and Duchess passed. As they came in on the ship. And
Duke
he
and
said,
Duchess of Kent.
Duke and Duchess of
Duchess of
Kent,
Kent.
who had been sent to represent Her Majesty the Queen. The Queen and Prince Philip came later that year. They came in December of 1961. People sometimes think they were there for independence, but they were not. And I took him to the spot, and he was surprised. I said, this is where I was standing. I was attending a school called Kleintown School, and it was a hot, sweltering day. And as you say, the excitement was unbelievable. And for me, I'd been born in London, but my parents, all I ever heard them talk about was, we have to be home in time for independence celebrations. And that's when they moved back from London. My father studied as a barrister, my mother as a nurse. And so that euphoria, that excitement was there, and it ran through us. I mean, the whole country obviously came to a standstill on that day. And the subsequent independence days actually were very much kind of filled with that excitement because it was all new to us. You know, the country was finding its way. We thought, you know, if you lived in Sierra Leone at the time, and I always say this, it's hard to imagine if you live in Sierra Leone now, but if you lived in Sierra Leone in 1961 up to 64, and there's an important reason why I mentioned 64, because that's when the first Prime Minister died. In fact, he died the day after independence, which was quite sort of a dampener. If you lived there, you actually believed that you could achieve anything. We probably thought we could achieve sending a man to the moon, you know, because education was a big thing that they promoted. And, you know, in February 1964, Sierra Leone became the first country in the world to have self-adhesive stamps. You didn't have to lick stamps anymore, thanks to Sierra Leone. 1964. You know, so this was a country that thought big, that thought, you know,
Absolutely.
so there was that euphoria which carried on for a few years, and then it started to dissipate. And for us, I think it came with the death of the first Prime Minister, Sir Milton Margai. But as I said, my father came back and he told us, by then I was 10 years old when Gambia became independent. And I was quite excited to hear what he had to say. You know, mainly he came to visit family, but he was here at the time of the independence. And for us, he came back with all that excitement still. Yeah.
Absolutely. For me, it's an image. We share that excitement bit. And for you, quite interesting, it was a privilege. Only grade 5s for us, everybody. to merge. Absolutely. So for me, this image is like that excitement. And we had to get the new uniforms. And in the morning, giving to march. And then you singing Ligay Jotna. You knew that you were doing something significant, you know, something symbolically really weighted, but you had no idea what it was. In many ways, you had no idea what it was.
Right.
And then in the afternoon, the athletics.
Yes.
People from all over the country.
Yep.
And I remember this particular year because when they came, you know, they were put to live with people who
Right.
lived in the urban areas.
Yeah.
And I remember I had a friend from there. I took one from 1 year.
Right.
So that's the image of
Right,
independence
right.
for me.
Yeah.
So now we go into it. The beginnings. And really, when I started thinking about the beginnings was once I heard that Berkeley Rice book.
Yes.
Very popular when we were growing up. Because apparently we were not viable as a nation.
Sure.
So he had this improbable nation. I only got to think about it as a grown-up. Then I thought, wow, how were things like? What were the circumstances in which we gained independence? Because what I need to judge later depends on initial conditions.
Indeed.
So can we begin from there? Who would like to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, to take the improbable nation thing, for a lot of time, there'd always been a connection between Sierra Leone and the Gambia, including in a time when the Gambia was effectively ruled from Sierra Leone. A lot of the civil service were there, and then they started exchanging civil servants. But when Gambia started pushing for independence, there were other competing forces, people saying, why don't you form a union with Senegal and become Senegambia? So there was that pressure because they kept saying to them, you're too small to exist on your own, you know, and hence the whole thing about this being an improbable nation. Because if you look at the Gambia, it almost doesn't make sense geographically. This small slither of water going through Senegal and then completely surrounded by it apart from the Atlantic Ocean. Why not subsume it within Senegal? So there were all these pressures and there were all these things that, you know, and the determination that they said, well, no, we have slightly different tradition, mainly from the colonial one, really, because in terms of our tribes, you know, what we call in Sierra Leone nations, we shared the same. You know, we had people, you know, from the same tribes in both countries, so it made sense from that. But they were fighting from the sense that, no, you have a French tradition, we have a British tradition, an inherited tradition, essentially. But those were the kind of competing forces at the time of independence. So it wasn't easy because Gambia was so small. And it wasn't even the Senegalese who were telling them this. It was the whole, the rest of the world were telling them, go into this federation or confederation. And they resisted it. And one has to salute them for that.
Even the UN had to prepare a certain report on that. So this is, Mr. Njai, isn't it? I've read somewhere, what, 2 hospitals, Bansang and Royal Victoria Hospital, 4 secondary schools. How many graduates? A dozen, possibly. University graduates, we mean. Schools, I said, few. How many kilometer roads paved? I don't know, about 50, I've read somewhere. So you can understand, really, the situation, the conditions in which we gain independence. What weight, what value would you put to that, given what happened afterwards, at least how you perceive what happened afterwards?
Let's take a bit of memory lane and, you know, look at these things broadly from a continental perspective. If you look at one of the, you know, reasons that, you know, of course, led to the agitation for independence, the rise of nationalism or nationalist struggles or movements in Africa, you realize that India gained independence in 1947 was one factor or reason that kind of motivated African leaders at the time to say, well, if India could gain independence in 1947, why not Africa? And exactly 10 years later, Ghana, of course, gained independence, became the first country in Black Africa to gain independence under, of course, the leadership of Nkrumah. And in 1958, Guinea became the first French colony to say, oh, look, we prefer independence. This was under de Gaulle, Charles de Gaulle at the time, who came with the Fifth Republic. And of course, the condition that was attached by the French was that for you, if you want to be granted independence, that's fine, but we wouldn't give you aid, we wouldn't give you money.
Yeah,
and Sekou Touré said that he prefer you know, freedom in poverty than richness in slavery. And he went for independence, and of course, Guinea held referendum in September 1958, and overwhelmingly they voted for independence, and that's how Guinea gained independence. And of course, the French, because they were not happy with that, in fact, when they were leaving, if you read, you know, Martin Meredith's book, The State of Africa, you know, the French had to pack everything, even the light, the bulbs in the offices and everything. They had to pack, exactly. So, I mean, other countries, of course, French colonies now, you know, started, you know, agitating for independence. So of course, with the exception of Algeria and a few others, you know, all of them were able to have it peacefully. And, you know, British colonies as well, including the Gambia, we did not fight War of Independence, except Kenya, the Mau Mau rebellion. Sure. You know, we were able to have our independence, kind of, people call it a silver platter, even though I don't agree to this, because I think, for me, no road or struggle to independence is easy. I mean, you have to go through certain things, even though some will go to War of Independence, but we did not go through that. And 1965, we also realized that, look, there is need for us to be granted independence. And of course, you made mention of the possibility of merging the Gambia and Senegal, but, you know, due to colonial experiences or differences in colonial experience, and of course, administrative-wise, in terms of how the French and the British were running these colonies, this was the non-starter. And of course,
but of course, yeah, we have to say, Jawara said no.
Jawara said no.
See,
Of course.
so possibly, I've heard some historians say that, imagine if we had P.S. Njai as the first president, possibly we would have had that merger with Senegal. So already the ethnic background comes into play.
Exactly.
That's the wall of Senegal and the Mandinka.
Exactly. And
so,
of course, Jawara at the time, I mean, probably would have favored an idea of a confederation. And fast forward in 1982, the confederation was born.
Yeah.
But if you look at the whole thing as well, looking at the Gambia at the time, I mean, Barclay Rice, when he wrote his book, 1968, this was published, The Birth of an Improbable Nation, Enter the Gambia. Yeah. So, I mean, it was like Gambia was not viable, could not survive as an independent state because of the population. At the time, in 1965, our population was 300,000, you know, with...
no resources.
Few resources, obviously.
Oh, very
so,
few.
I mean, it was a moment of, you know, skepticism among those who were skeptical whether Gambia could survive as an independent state. But I think fundamentally, from 1965, when we gained this political independence...
we'll come to that.
Exactly.
We just want to lay the background. We'll come to 1965, then move on.
And if I can just go back very quickly to 1948, the conference, the London conference.
That's where you're coming to.
Okay, cool.
To set the broader, the global background, because we need to go back to the Second World War, the ending of the Second World War. Yes? Because even in Europe and America, there was this sense of renewal.
This is it.
A new movement. This was the wind of change.
Sure.
Even though Macmillan said it in South Africa, we sometimes think that he was talking about us. It was about the world.
It was about the world. It was about the world.
About the world. So they give us that context,
well,
because so even though there was India in Asia, but Ceylon, today we call it Sri Lanka, Burma, they were all also gaining independence in the 1940s.
This is it. And so the African nations, particularly the former British colonies, they felt, okay, you've asked us to fight in the name of freedom, and you've told us that this is freedom for mankind, not just freedom for, essentially it was a European war. They called it a world war, but it was European powers fighting each other. And so when they went back, they'd seen things and they thought differently. And they thought, no, we want to be masters of our own destiny, you know, because you've asked us to fight. And in some of our own countries, we do not even have freedoms. And I'll give you an example. Our first Prime Minister, he had an English wife. And one of the things that galvanized him to get into politics, he was a doctor. He'd never been involved in politics. Went back to Sierra Leone with his wife, who wanted to take him into the local golf club in Freetown. And they told him, no Africans allowed in his own country. 1950. And he was like, what do you mean? I trained in England. I trained in Scotland. Nobody ever said to me, don't come in here because you're black. And I come to my own country? And this happens. And so in 1948, you had this conference in London where you had delegates from all the former British colonies descended on London. And even then they started talking about independence, about taking self-control. And it was, of course, it made all the newspapers in England, and you can find all the reports of it. I mean, a lot of it concentrated on how colorfully they were dressed. But it made people think, because for the British, it seemed incomprehensible that these people didn't want to still be under British rule and patronage. You know, what do you mean? We're looking after them. Why do they need to look after themselves? And one of the things that was argued, and for some they felt they were proved right, they used to say that what you have is an educated elite. You don't have an educated population that you can go to on matters of policy and ideology with a manifesto. All you will do is go to people, I'm from the same tribe, vote for me. And in a sense, they've been proved right, the people who said that at the time, because subsequent events actually showed that a lot of people, even now, in many countries where you don't have an educated population that you could go to with policies and ideas, you just say, I'm a Mandinka or I'm a Fula, vote for me. Yeah.
That's it. I mean, that was the main worry, remember, with Cabral. He was so worried about that. So he realized it was something that he had to tackle.
He had to deal with.
So he dealt with in the bush whilst they were fighting. So I'll come to you now, Mr. Njai. So with me as well, around that period, at the Manchester conference, Pan-African conference, I can always still remember, because at some point on Radio 4 in England, they dramatized that conference. And this line always stuck with me forever from then on. Africans, you haven't ruled yourselves for a very, very long time. Now you're going to want to rule yourselves. It's going to be extremely difficult. William Du Bois. Now let's go into 65. We started apparently with what, 745,000 pound grant in aid.
That's right.
Yeah. So that we could run our state. How would you characterize that period from 65 on politically? What is your take on that period?
Interesting. 1965, like you said, I mean, it was a very small country. Some call it a mini state. Some will call it a miniature colony. I mean, 300,000 people at the time. And of course, Gambia was one thing that Gambia was credited for. Is being one of the leading multi-party democracies on the continent. If you look at it, even before independence, we had different political parties being created in the Gambia. We had the Ibrahim Gabajahumpa's party, Muslim, that's the Muslim Congress. The other one again, JC5, the PPP scheme. So multi-party system was here. When compared to a lot of other African countries at the time, who created one-party states. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Touré in Guinea, Hastings Kamuzu Banda in Malawi, Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, the Julius Nyerere in Tanzania, you name them, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya. But at the time, we had multi-party system.
And Nigeria had already had a coup d'etat by the time.
Yes, and I will add this. A lot of people used to go to Jawara and sort of advise him to form a multi-party.
Exactly.
He said no. He genuinely believed in multi-party.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it would have been easy. You know how we are like, people will say yes.
Exactly. So we were credited for that, together with countries like Mauritius and Botswana for a period, at least, even though it's the Khan family in Botswana that have been ruling. The Ian Kama and the Seres Kama. But I mean, we were credited for that, and continuing even up to 1994 when we had. I'll get to that because that was a U-turn in Ghana.
Absolutely. So we were the first part.
Exactly. We were credited for that. The whole 1965, coming to 1970 when we attained that Republican status with Jawara becoming president, Gambia had always had that multi-party system. But mind you, also within that multi-party system, interestingly, we also had a dominant kind of party system because the PPP was the dominant party at the time. It dominated the political landscape. Even though it was only in 1982 that Gambians started voting directly for the president, because we were voting like the British system, voting for parties with the majority, that's where the prime minister will come and then the president also. But later, 1982, we started voting directly for the president, and this did not affect the multi-party system in place. Also, fundamentally, that Gambia was proud of at the time was also the human rights record, the reputation that the Gambia had in terms of respect for fundamental rights, and of course that was what precipitated or the need for the establishment of the African Commission, the headquarters of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, because the whole idea, the drafting of all that, the discussions, of creating the African Charter on Human and People's Rights took place in the Gambia, and that is why it is called the Banjul Charter. And also the African Center for Democracy and Human Rights Studies is also housed in the Gambia. So the Gambia, I mean, at the time, and you also have to remember continentally, this was at a time when human rights violations were rampant on the continent, and that was why the African Union, which was created, of course, in 1963, I mean, saw the need to come up with a charter that will respect fundamental, that will commit African countries to respect fundamental rights and freedoms. Because remember, the rise of dictators on the continent started in the 60s, early 60s. In Central African Republic, you had the Jean Bedel Bokasses. In Equatorial Guinea, you had the Masuya Nguema, the current president's uncle that he overthrew and executed later. But of course, in Uganda too, we had Idi Amin. These were the three most brutal dictators on the continent at the time. And of course, interestingly about it, you realize that they all left power in the same year, 1979, due to various circumstances. Of course, kleptocrats like Mobutu was also on the continent at the time. So despite all this situation, rampant human rights violations on the continent, Gambia was an exception, even though we were not perfect because we were starting days. But we could pride ourselves of being one of the strongest advocates for fundamental rights and freedoms, and of course, with a multi-party system in place at the time when a lot of other African countries built that one-party state. And of course, there is a reason behind why this, even though for me it's not genuine, but for them, the likes of Nkrumah, when you talk to them, they, as he famously said, seek ye first the political kingdom, and then all others will be added unto you. For them, African countries already colonialists came, put together societies that were initially antagonistic, and they felt like if we should adopt a multi-party system, it is going to further divide our continent. People will be divided on ethnic lines and religious lines, and for them, it is the best thing was to build a one-party state where one political party, one ideology, one leader, everybody will look up to. But the reason why I have a problem with this is that compared to, let's say, Gambia practicing multi-party system, Nigeria or Ghana practicing, one-party system in the name of unification. But was Ghana, and is Ghana united than the Gambia is, even though these countries are bigger in terms of sociocultural setups, but I mean, are they more united because of that one-party system than the Gambia that practice multi-party system? So it was not a genuine reason, but there is a reason behind all this. I mean, how they wanted to consolidate themselves in power.
Absolutely. So just one question before I go to Ade here. So because there you sort of portraying sort of a glowing, certainly approbatory picture of what the president did. So politically, what would you point to perhaps to say, I'm not sure about that? Well, signed the confederation. Afterwards, he formed the army. Maybe that's a political question as well. What would you point to what he did politically and say, I'm not sure about that? Because it seems that you approve of the democracy, the human rights, and really how exceptional, it was an exceptional case. So I think give us a more critical analysis politically of what was going on.
I mean, if you look at, like I said, 70, Jawara became president, attained Republican status. But I think one thing that, even though it was a multi-party system, Jawara, for me, in my view, he also, what a lot of people say, overstayed in power, stayed for 30 years. So at some point, the democracy, the reputation would have been greater if Jawara had ruled for a period and then leave for somebody else to come. That will mean that our democracy was flourishing, our multi-party democracy was flourishing at the time. But he also stayed for long. And then 1982, the confederation, the decision to go into the confederation, Mr. Ade will know that, obviously, it was a marriage of convenience. Jawara was never convinced to go into the confederation with these people. But because in 81, the Senegalese came and restored him in power, and now what the Wolof will say, Delon Jukal. So he had to do it. He had no other option but to go in for it. And but also importantly, wise of him, he was also a shrewd politician at some point. When he went into this agreement in 1982, 2 years later in 1984, the Gambia had a standing army because he was also thinking that what the Senegalese did to us helped us to restore me in power. If we should have another ugly scenario again, Senegal will have to come in again. So we need a standing army. So that was a wise decision. But I think where he also had some mistakes was, overstaying in power, because also, when leaders overstay in power, when they stay longer in power, they kind of, tend to develop those dictatorial tendencies. We wouldn't know what would have happened if the military had not intervened in 1994. Probably no one can tell. We would have had another dictatorship in the Gambia.
Interesting. Good point. Where to stop. Go for a short break. We'll be right back.
As the fastest growing GSM company in the Gambia, QCell has the widest 4G plus coverage in the country, 3 times faster internet speed than our competitors. So switch now and dial *335# and enjoy what true 4G feels like. QCell, the Gambia's trusted network.
Welcome back to the Viewpoint. Today we have what we call our Independence Special, sort of independence reappraise, 58 years since we had our independence. So what have we learned so far? I've got my 2 guests here. the political science lecturer at the University of the Gambia, Mr. Sanjay, and of course, our very own historian, the editor-in-chief of QTV, Mr. Adedarame. Adedara, just before the break, you were trying to analyze, sort of get some of the key significant factors, as it were, that define, can we say that, sort of the Fourth Republic in many ways.
Sure.
And in the end, he said the president overstayed good things, the democracy, the human rights. That was the main asset. For us, for any kind of development came through that. That was the gateway asset, as it were.
For sure.
How do you see it and compare to other countries? Always just try to bring in that broader
well,
context.
Yes, I mean, to bring the broader context and to bring the broader context, including particularly in our sub-region. So we've mentioned Sékou Touré in Guinea-Conakry. We've mentioned Senghor in Senegal. You had Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was the first independent African country where an opposition party deposed the incumbent party, and that was in the 1967 election. But after that, things changed very, very rapidly, because in fact, when the opposition party, the All People's Congress, actually won the election and went in to be sworn in as the new government by the Governor General, that was the day we had our first coup d'etat. And my father was one of those who'd gone to receive, the blessings of the Governor General. And in Nigeria, you'd had coup d'etats. People like Tafawa Balewa had been killed. You mentioned Ghana and the route that Ghana had taken. These were all, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, and the Gambia, all former British colonies. And you saw the divergent routes they were taking. You talked about a multi-party system in the Gambia, very much so. In Sierra Leone, there were only two. Essentially, it was multi-party, but there were only two parties really that mattered. Between them, they got more than 95% of the vote. So the other parties were just kind of making up the numbers. And that was true at independence, and it is true today. APC, SLPP, they're the only two that have ever ruled the country. They've never even had to do it in coalition. So, as the Gambia was going through these changes, as you said, you look at somebody like Jawara, people keep saying, I've said many times, why did he not resist the temptation and stand down and hand over? We're not very good at doing that in Africa. This is the continent that has had, I checked before we came in, we've had more long-term presidents than any other continent. We've had presidents doing 42 years, 38 years, 37 years, Sassou Nguesso, the likes of, Muammar Gaddafi, across the continent, Paul Biya in Cameroon. Cameroon's only had two presidents in 61 years. Two. Ridiculous. And so these countries, but what I always say is that for me, this is a part of a process of us finding our feet. Mr. Mboj teases me that, since Jammeh was deposed electorally, I've always used the phrase that we're getting used to being a democracy. We're learning how to be a democracy. 58 years, that's nothing that we supposedly have taken. The countries we're trying to compare ourselves with and to, they've had 100 years of this, 300 years, some of them, 400 years, some of them, and yet we're saying, oh, we're not there. Oh, look, you can only, if I pinch you, I know what a pinch feels like, but only you know what that pinch feels like. So just because we can read up on the history of other countries and what they've gone through politically, doesn't mean we can emulate them. We have to go through our own pains, our own birth pains, and we're still going through those birth pains after 58 years. We're not going to get there. In some countries have leapt, as I'm always bringing up but he mentioned Amilcar Cabral, and he set a record in terms of a rebel movement, so-called rebel movement, for the number of schools and hospitals they built whilst they were in the bush. There are African countries that haven't done as much since they became independent, and yet they did that. There are lessons to learn, but these growing pains are what we're still going through.
Absolutely. So I will connect it really in my next question. So the political aspects, I think, maybe we've scored, 7 or 8 out of 10? But it takes more than that, doesn't it?
Quite.
Well, you see me still pass, a little bit above 5, it's all right. So, apparently the standard model for development, because what's the point of independence if not really to develop? Because we were behind the whole time. So we talked about agricultural production. We also talked about mining natural resources and the like for export. This were the models. There is a criticism. I'm not sure how you will respond to this. But with Africa at least, we focus on the politics so much that it influenced the economics to our detriment. Because now, how are we to judge President Jawara's era, for instance, economically? We are told that in the early 60s, GDP was growing by perhaps 4%.
Yeah.
And they were sort of doing well.
That's right.
But again, once you have a drought, everything you work toward goes down the drain. And that's in the 70s, and people will blame you for that. I think my question is, I'm not sure how you're going to respond to this, but all the time that we had this political euphoria, we had not prepared for really the economic development. It hardly got mentioned. What do you think about that? Did we get the economic? Because the political and the economic, they're really together, aren't they? That's why they call it political economy. Absolutely. So what do you think about the economics? That's why we've not been able to develop economically. We seem so backward. Nothing is working economically. What do you think about that?
I mean, we go back to the roots in 1965. And this is a question that I've always raised. And we need to ask ourselves, we need to ask this fundamental question, where our founding fathers, we call them at independence, were they able to conceptualize the notion of independence, what independence mean? Was it just about, oh, now the Queen is no more, or the Queen is just the head of state, whatever, the Governor General is not here, now we have a Prime Minister. Was it all about that? Was it all about every 18 February gathering somewhere, doing march past, remembering, oh, the Gambian flag was hoisted and the Prime Minister, Dawda Jawara, read a statement? Was it all about that? Did they prepare, I mean, us to look towards economic independence? It's not only political. Independence is way beyond that. It's not only that, oh, we have our own government now. No. If it is about that, we had internal self-government back in 1963. But independence is beyond that. It's also about being able to, I mean, run, administer your own development projects. And the economy forms an important part of that. But since 1965 up to now, I mean, I think, for me, the Gambian that was born in 1965, 18 February 1965, is still the same Gambian. The mindset, the attitude that the Gambian had in 18 February 1965 is still the same mindset. You're talking about agriculture. It is sad in 2023, we still beg for rice from the Japanese, from the Chinese.
From the Koreans.
When we have the land, exactly, when we have the land, we have the River Gambia, we have everything at our disposal. It is unfortunate that 2023, you made mention of an education system. We still have that same colonial education system that we inherited from the colonial powers. And this education system is the driving force to change the economic trajectory of this country. Our economy cannot be changed if we don't have the right education system. But the same education system that these colonial powers don't even, I mean, they abandoned it, one can say. They've moved on. It's the same education system that we're stuck with. And our economy...
But isn't that the key? Because here we were entering into a terrain where there were no models. That's why it wasn't simply a problem for Africa. It was a simple problem for people, places like even India. They're still trying to find their feet economically.
So that has to do
all
with,
of them.
That has to do with the problem of conceptualizing the notion of independence. Like I said, then Nkrumah even said in 57, seek ye first the political kingdom, then all others will be added to you. Nkrumah was very much conscious that independence was beyond just political, just having your own government. He knew that at some point, African governments or African countries must stand on their own, not to receive directives from outsiders. Okay, what we call, kleptocratic governments in place, but we also have what we call kleptocracy, where I mean, foreign business entities will dictate what happens on the continent. They will not necessarily be in power, but they will dictate. They'll be behind governments dictating. So the type of Gambia that we have created, what type of Gambia have we created from 1965 now? Is this the type of Gambia that our founding fathers envisaged, that after 58 years of independence, we will be in a Gambia where we cannot even have a machine to test the drugs and foods that enter this country?
Did you say that they envisaged that?
No. I'm
They
saying,
did not.
is that the type of
Gambia
Gambia
they envisaged?
Yeah,
But this is the key, isn't it? They didn't. Obviously, they wouldn't.
they didn't envisage that?
Of course,
So that is why I said, were they able to really define the concept of independence to us? Because what we tend to understand, because like I said, we have in the discussion what we started with, oh, the independence euphoria.
That's
and
it.
when you go out there, I remember, in fact, the president, when he was out on the set 3 weeks ago, he said nationalism seems to get lost now. I remember, he said, I remember those days, independence, you know, the euphoria is always there, but now it's no more there. Now, here's the head of state thinking along that line. That is why I'm saying, do we really think independence is beyond politics or political independence? Or does it just have to be, or because we have our own government? So if the president is thinking along this line, or the euphoria is not there, it shows you that the average Gambian thinks that independence is merely about gathering, march past, reading statements, reminding ourselves of the struggle our forefathers have gone through or our founding fathers have gone through. But it is beyond that. Is this the type of Gambia that we want to? You see, we're here kind of questioning our founding fathers in 65, whether they've really done a good job in terms of conceptual. I mean, they've done a good job in terms of getting us out from colonial rule, the bondage of colonialism, but we're questioning whether they've done a good job in terms of, I mean, conceptualizing the notion of independence for us. If we're not mindful, 100 years to come, 200 years to come, our kids will also question, our grandkids will also question.
But you realize that these questionings will always happen. It doesn't matter what you do. Perhaps there's a faction somewhere in history or now who wouldn't agree. So you know that
I think the questioning
things
will
are
stop at some
contested.
point.
You know that most concepts, social concepts, political concepts, they are always contested.
Yeah,
different schools of thought, different ideas, and the like. But are they? So I'll come back to you. Sure. I once, because when we take our heroes like Nyerere, Kaunda, and the like, the way we see them, the way we talk about them, is always hagiographical, isn't it?
Yeah.
They're like saints.
Yes.
But I was listening to Lee Kuan Yew in an address. It was called Third World, Hope or Despair. He said, Nyerere, Kaunda, brilliant people, Christians, absolutely honest, but the economic model was wrong. Isn't it? So we really, in his own evaluation, perhaps the leaders oversimplified the work that was to be done. That was what, as Cabral once said, independence was the first step.
And this is it.
It's a long ladder.
Road.
The ladder is so long. You've taken the first step, then euphoria. Look what you said, for us, it wasn't euphoria, it was about worry.
Yes, indeed, and it has to be about worry.
See it generally, yes.
Because it's, you know, like somebody gets something and then they party so hard that they forget that there's hard work to be done. And I think that is the charge that we can level at the door. Because if you take a country like Sierra Leone, and I know you said let's broaden this, with all its natural resources and its size, it should be one of the richest countries in the world. We have diamonds, we have gold, we have bauxite, we have iron ore in plentiful numbers. And yet look at the country. It's a wretch of a country in terms of development and progress, economically and otherwise. They did not think beyond that. What they loved was the concept of freedom, not the think about, okay, so the day after I become free, what do I do? How do I take my country to the next level? The reason we keep mentioning Cabral is because those are exactly the things he addressed. I mentioned once to Mr. Mboj, I found a clip where he said, somebody asked him, why this emphasis on education? He said, because the day we take power, we have to be able to run our country for the next 100 years without anybody pointing fingers at us saying, look at them, they took over, they don't even know what they're doing. That's how they should have been thinking. That's how, and yet these countries, they just felt that it was, okay, we've now got, and then they had this cozy relationship with the former colonizers, with Britain giving preferential treatment to Britain rather than going to the highest bidder when it came to people who wanted their gold or their diamonds. They gave preferential treatment to Britain out of gratefulness. No, they should have been fighting with everybody else to pay the highest price for what you have. And so that planning was never there. And so because of that, the excitement, the euphoria, we look at them and we think, gosh, you guys were all brilliant intellectuals, but what have you done to us? You know, where did you take us? Why didn't you insist that, you know, we should have more structural engineers, more architects, more this, more that. You know, people who could build the nation and take the nation forward. For many years in all of those countries, the people who were doing all these jobs, including structural engineers, they were all foreigners. They were bringing in people from Britain to come and show us how to make our roads, right, rather than training enough of our own people to be able to do it. And in case we're still doing it with the way we're bringing in China now to come and do some of the roads in some of the countries. You know, and that for me was the big failing. Yes, you thought brilliantly about the concept of independence, about wanting to be free, but the day after you are free and you have to take control of your own destiny, are you ready to do it? Are you preparing for it? And we were not.
That's it. So this is where I want us to go. The reason for the failures is for me, this concept of the individual and the structures. Because I don't want to, I cannot believe that, oh, Africans, we're just so particularly bad. You know what I mean? We are so bad. I mean, often when you look at somebody's motivations to take a particular action, you're like, okay, all right, I understand. So I want to understand here the relationship between individuals and institutions.
Sure.
It's a bit like chicken and egg question, isn't it? It's a very, very, very difficult one. Why is it that our leaders have been doing these awful things to us? You know what I mean?
Sure.
The promise of taking care of the people somehow in the end becomes the reality of taking care of yourself and your group.
Yeah.
What is it about the system that makes that so easy to do? So we have to go beyond leaders, don't we? So the cultural, the society also comes in, because I think this link is very important. I do hear some people say that leadership is nothing but a reflection of what you are. Isn't it?
Certainly.
So isn't that really where the problem is? If we cannot locate it, maybe we'll just be going round in circles thinking that, oh, this man is bad, Modumboji is such a bad person, but if Sanjay comes, he will make it all right. Not if the structure is rotten.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back a bit.
Yes.
I just want to pick where he was, from where he stopped. And if you look at, I mean, it's a sad case for Africa. 1946-47, when the Second World War ended in 45, the Marshall Plan was rolled out by the US to bail out European economies or European countries as a result of the devastating impact of World War II that affected their economies. We're talking about millions of dollars given to, I mean, European powers or European countries at the time.
And it ended up being billions.
Exactly.
Yes, yes.
But Africa, right from the go, from independence, in the 60s, these people started rolling out, giving us money, aid coming. Of course, was the name of the Kenyan lady who wrote this book, Dead Aid, Dambisa Moyo.
Yes, Dambisa Moyo.
How aid is not working for Africa. From 1960, I mean, billions of dollars. We're not talking about millions, but billions of dollars were pumped in Africa. Imagine you claim to be independent. Oh, you want independence. And right from there, you start taking money from these people. And they came with their conditions attached to them. Back to the economic aspect. If you look at the end of the Cold War, before that, in fact, the structural adjustment program, when it came, one condition, it was about devaluing our currency.
That's right.
I mean, retrenching the civil service, which also kind of created social and political instability within the continent. But even at the end of the Cold War, when multi-party democracy came, the third wave of democratization, Samuel Huntington will call it, there were political and economic conditions. And economic conditions were that these countries that refuse to adopt the structural adjustment program must adopt it before
but you
we
see,
can
Mr.
bring in
Guy,
money.
that's your reality, though.
Yeah.
I cannot blame the IMF or I blame
No, no,
others. So you know what I mean?
No,
this is your reality.
I'm not blaming.
How do you deal
blaming.
with it?
Exactly.
So
I'm
how do
coming
you
to that.
deal with
I'm
it?
not
Isn't it?
necessarily blaming the IMF.
No, I know what you mean. I mean,
Exactly.
but
So
how
I
do you
mean,
deal with that?
the mindset, like you talk about the individual, the leadership, or the leader being a reflection of the society. To this point in 2023, how many of us, like individually, are thinking that in 50 years to come, in 100 years to come, we must free ourselves from the bondage of neocolonialism? What Kuruma called, you know, the neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism in his book. He said that...
I wonder how he knew that it was the last. There could be another one.
He said, you know, the developing countries must realize that the developed powers are using them for their own development. And that the underdeveloped countries will never become developed through the generosity or the goodwill of the developed powers.
Absolutely.
We must realize that. So the individual today, how many of us are thinking that in 50 years' time, in 100 years' time, we must stop importing rice, for example. We must, I mean, be able to run our own affairs without having any influence from outsiders. I remember when the draft constitution was rejected. Some politicians were out to say, oh, because the British embassy, I think the US embassy and the German, you know, High Commissioner embassy here wrote, the British High Commission, wrote to say that they're encouraging the parliamentarians at the time to give chance to the draft constitution. These people are saying, oh, the Gambia is a sovereign, independent country. This is our internal affair. I said, the draft constitution that you're talking about, these people have their money in. The transitional justice program that you're talking about, they have their money in. Why wouldn't they have a say?
So let's move us on.
Sure.
Isn't it, Adam?
Sure.
What are the structural vulnerabilities? And this is precisely what it is. This is what the Brits, the Americans, Russians, Chinese, they are all milking it.
Sure.
The vulnerabilities that makes us so easy, so open, that makes us prey to any predatory adventure that they might have. And that's really the heart of it.
That's at the heart of it.
So when I'm out of power, it's easy to say that, oh, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that. Now, you go into power, now you're faced with realities, it's a different ball game. What do you think?
It's very much a different ball game, and what you tend to get is that when people do get into power, reality bites. A lot of things that you could promise, you're suddenly not able to do. And if you take the African countries, and I'll go back just very, very slightly, myself and others have argued that in the same way that the Marshall Plan was used to restructure Europe, one of the biggest things that we've always contended with, there should have been a Marshall Plan when we became independent, was the fact that hundreds of billions were spent to restructure Germany and Japan, the two defeated powers. If that amount of money had been given to nascent African countries that were independent, we would be talking about something different, most likely. But we didn't get it.
And of course, and they ran it properly.
Well, this is it. And
instead of forming all these state-owned companies, which became what? Tools of corruption.
They did. They did.
In fact,
so they started giving us handouts. But when we got to the stage where, you know, we could take control, you then, and I mentioned it earlier, about the bad deals that we struck, that our leaders struck on our behalf. It's even happening now. You know, when people are giving really bad deals to China, the kind of new colonizers in a sense, you know, in the way that we gave bad deals for our own countries to the British and to the French. And I've always wondered, why is it? If I have something that you want, I should be the one to tell you how much you should pay for it, not the other way around.
Absolutely.
And yet that's always been the way with Africa, in almost every country that you can mention.
Absolutely.
The person setting the price is not the buyer, you know. It should be the seller, and yet in every sense it's the buyer.
We're coming towards the end. That's the perfect context. Now we go to the younger man, the political scientist. We are on our way out. You guys are taking over. How would you, given this context that we have to operate within, how would you reimagine independence for the future?
Quickly, just before that, just to say the vulnerability, how vulnerable we are, to the extent, like you said, maybe Nkrumah did not know that this would be the last stage. Anyway, neocolonialism. I mean, he talked about China, how they understand how vulnerable we are, our structures are, to the extent of coming in. And that's what Tom Borges called in his book, The Looting Machine, how big financial conglomerates are getting access to resources in Angola, in DRC, a lot of other African countries, because of the vulnerability of their structures and how they can easily access our markets to develop their own continent. I mean, look at China, for example, coming inside Africa, knowing that China has a growing population, talking about 1.3 billion, and they cannot create employment opportunities for these people inside China. What do they do to create employment opportunities for their people outside China, in Africa to be specific, using what they call infrastructural diplomacy as opposed to Taiwan's checkbook diplomacy, bringing their engineers, bringing their equipment and all that. But then seeing the future, how will we look at the future, independence for the future? I've said it repeatedly, and even in the past, the past years when we celebrate to mark independence, I said, this is a moment to reflect rather than celebrating. It's a moment to reflect in the sense that where were we 1965, 58 years ago? Where are we right now? How has the journey been? And where are we heading to as a country? Is this the type of Gambia that we want to hand over to future generations? If really we're able to answer this fundamental question of what independence means, then we'll be able to hand over a safe Gambia, a better Gambia to future generations who will be proud to say that the Gambia was independent on the 18th February 1965.
Absolutely, very important. The discussion, the questions, they go on and on and on and on. So we've come to the end. Maybe just finally, what Lee Kuan Yew said towards the end. You see, when you have a state where corruption permeates the whole system, it takes nothing less than a revolution. It need not involve guns to change that fate. Okay. So thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you very much, viewers. Until next time, I'm Mamadou Mbodj. Have a happy Independence Day. Goodbye.